Hello and welcome to the video Spring Security Before Authentication Filter with me, Nam Ming from CodeJava.net. In this video, I would like to share with you how to write code to intervene the authentication process of Spring Security to perform a custom logic on attempt authentication just before the authentication process takes place. For example, we want to check for spam score before login to implement the one-time password functionality or unlock the user if the log time expires for implementing the limit failed login attempts functionality or any custom logic you want to execute just before the authentication process. Let me explain to you why and when we need to use before authentication filter. For example, when a user enters credential in the login page and just before the authentication process takes place by Spring Security, the application needs to check spam score using Google reCAPTCHA API to make sure that the request is made by human, not by a bot. If the spam score less than 0.5, we want the user to use one-time password to log in. Else, if the spam score greater than 0.5, we process the authentication as normal. And upon successful login, we can execute custom logic using a login success handler. Similarly, we can also execute custom logic upon failed login using a login failure handler. And in order to intervene the authentication process to perform some custom logic just before the authentication process, we need to install a filter. This filter will be executed before a Spring Security filter. And in this video, I will show you how to write code to implement this before authentication filter in a Spring Boot project. Let me show you an existing Java Spring Boot project here. You see, in this project, Spring Security is used to perform authentication with the customer login page, as you can see here in this Spring Security configuration file. And let me start this application to demo the login function. Okay, you see, so the application has restarted uh, with embedded Tomcat server on port number 80, and the context path is /shopme here. Now let me use Chrome browser to access this application on localhost /shopme here. You see, and this is the home page of the application. And as the customer, I can log in using email and password. Okay, you see I have successfully logged in. And in the next few minutes, I will show you how to write code to intervene the authentication process in order to perform custom logic just before the authentication process. And through this video, I will show you how to implement before authentication filter in two different ways, simple and advanced. So let's create a new Java class here before authentication filter. And we have this class extends the username and password authentication filter here, and generate constructor. Okay, generate. And note that when we use an authentication filter for before the Spring Security filter, all the configurations we configure after the form login here will be ignored by Spring Security. So in this authentication filter, we must configure username parameter, default success URL, success handler, failure handler in this filter. And in this project, you see I use the custom login page here, and the name of the username field is an email here. So we need to set username parameter is email. As you can see, this will be ignored by Spring Security when we use an authentication filter. So in the constructor, we need to call super set username parameter is email, and we also need to set requires authentication request matcher. So this filter will be invoked only for the login process. And as you can see, we use the login URL. The default login processing URL used by Spring Security is /login here. So we specify the new and add request matcher here with the URL button is /login, and the HTTP method is post. So this filter will be executed only upon login for this login URL, not on every request to the application. And in order to perform custom logic, we need to override the callback method attempt authentication here. You see, and in this callback method attempt authentication, we can access the request and response. Here for testing purpose, I get the email from the request get parameter email, and print the email. Attempt authentication. This callback method will be called before the authentication process. Email, and the call to super attempt authentication, we delegate the authentication processing to Spring Security. Okay, and in the Spring Security configuration file here, we need to write a new method private before authentication filter get custom filter. And in this method, we create a new instance of before authentication filter equal new before authentication filter, and return the filter. And here then we can configure this filter such as the authentication manager is required by Spring Security when we configure an before authentication filter. So we must call this method set authentication manager, and we can use the default method of provided by Spring Security authentication manager here. And we need to add throws declaration for this method. Okay, so this is a seamless implementation of before authentication filter. And here, before the form login, here we need to call add filter before here, and the filter object is from the REST custom filter, and the filter class is before authentication filter dot class. Okay, save all the changes, and we are ready to test. start the application. So this is a simplest way to implement an authentication filter that will be executed before the authentication process. Okay, the application is up and running without any errors. And now let me try to log in. Successful, you see. And in the console view, you can see it prints attempt authentication with the email of the user here. That means the code in the callback method here, attempt authentication was actually invoked, and we can write code to perform to run custom logic here before the login process. Now let me log out from the application. Click log out link here, and let me try to make a failed login with the wrong password here. And you can see we got an error. It's because when we use an authentication filter, we need to configure the authentication failure handler for the filter as well to avoid this error when a user fails to log in here. So we need to set the authentication failure handler here, and we first simple use we create a anonymous class that is subclass of the simple URL authentication failure handler here, and we override the callback method on authentication failure here. And in this callback method on authentication failure, we need to specify the default redirect URL in case failed login. Set default failure URL is this URL /login error, which is the default failure login URL used by Spring Security. And for testing purpose, we print something here to indicate that this callback method has been invoked here. Okay, that's it. To avoid the error when the user fails to log in, and it should display the error message directly in the login page. Okay, so save the changes. We got an error here. Okay, now let me try to make another failed login attempt with the wrong password, and this time we should display the login error message. Here you see the login error message is bad credentials here directly in the login page. So that's why when implementing before authentication filter, we also need to set the authentication failure handler here. And in the console view, you can see it also prints on authentication failure here. That means this callback method has been invoked by Spring Security upon failed login attempt. Now I'm going to show you an advanced implementation of a before authentication filter. In practice, the before authentication filter will depend on one or more business classes to perform the customer logics in the callback method attempt authentication here. For example, in this filter, I want to use the customer services class to perform some business logics related to customer here, customer services class here. So typically we auto-write we will declare a reference to the customer service class here. Customer services, customer service, and we annotate this field using the auto-while annotation to let Spring Framework to inject an instance of the customer service class into this class before authentication filter. To do so, we need to annotate this class using the component annotation. So Spring Framework, we create an instance of this uh, class before authentication filter when needed. So in the Spring security configuration file here, we don't need to have to use this code. So delete, and we need to declare a reference to the before authentication filter here. Before authentication filter, and use the annotation auto-while here to tell Spring Framework to automatically create an instance of this class and inject into this method here. You see, so by doing this way of configuration, we can have the authentication filter use external business classes such as the customer service class here in the callback method. For example, customer equal customer service get customer by email here, and we check if customer is not known. Print something here, customer file, for example, and print the first name of the customer. Get first name. And to configure an authentication filter like this, we need to override some methods here. So go to source, override implement methods. We need to override this method. Here, set authentication manager is required. And in case we need to use a success handler and failure handler, we need to override these methods as well. So 3 methods. Okay. Set authentication manager is required, and we use the annotation auto-while here to tell Spring Security we inject an instance of authentication manager into this setter method, as well as for this authentication success handler. And authentication failure handler. Okay, and we have one authentication. We create separate classes for success handler and failure handler. Authentication success handler, and have this class extend the symbol URL authentication success handler here, and override the callback method on authentication success. This method will be invoked by Spring Security upon a successful login. So here for testing purpose, we just print something here. And similarly, we need to create the class authentication failure handler here. and have this class extends the simple URL authentication failure handler and override a callback method on authentication failure. Here, this method will be invoked by Spring Security upon failed login attempt. And for testing purpose, we put in something here, and we need to set the default failure URL is /login error here. And to enable Spring Security, we create an instance of this class. We need to annotate this class using the component annotation. Similarly, for the authentication success handler component. Yeah. Okay. And now come to the Spring Security configuration file. We need to declare a method to expose the authentication manager bin. Yeah. Bin. We should override the method from the superclass. The method authentication manager bin here. Yeah. And we simply use the default code that returns the default authentication manager bin. And we need to specify the bin ID. Bin name is bin ID's authentication manager here. Okay. And in the authentication filter here, Spring Framework, we inject an instance of this authentication manager from this method into this setter method set authentication manager. So the before authentication filter will be configured correctly. Okay, now let me start this application again and test. So in practice, for more complex requirement, complex scenario, we need to do this kind of configuration for the before authentication filter. Okay, let me log in. And now I made a failed login. I got the error message here. And in the console view, you can see it prints attempt authentication customer file on authentication failure here. Customer file, and the first name of the customer is Nam. That means this logic was executed here. Get customer by email. And now let me try to make a successful login with the correct password. Okay, I am in. And you see in the console view, it prints attempt authentication customer file and on authentication success here. Okay, so that's how to implement before authentication filter in Spring Security. So far I have shared with you how to implement before authentication filter with Spring Security in the Spring Boot project in order to perform custom logic before login. I hope you will find this video helpful. Please help me to grow this channel by subscribing and then like, comment and share this video. Thanks for watching.